the true people of God. And then they prided themselves on knowing his revealed will, obtained from the Ten Commandments and other Old Testament scriptures. They prided themselves on being able to make superior moral judgments. They were far beyond these ignorant Gentiles. They were instructed from the law. The law was a light to their feet. So these wonderful privileges gave the Jews a false security. They were deluded into believing that they were acceptable God, and that was compared with the abysmal ignorance of the Gentiles, and so they looked really good in God's eyes. Now we must be careful, though, when we look at and show contempt for their spiritual blindness, because it's so easy for us to fall into the same trap. It's so easy to imagine that we're okay because we know so much more about the Bible than the average person on the street, especially in this day and age when sadly many people don't even know what Easter is all about. I had a friend who went to see a specialist in Harley Street. Now, if you're a specialist in Harley Street, you've got to be pretty clever. You've got to be pretty smart. And my friend mentioned, in talking about the Bible, he mentioned Noah and his ark. And he got a completely blank look. This man knew nothing about Noah's ark. It was totally foreign to him. Well, we can read our Bibles, we can go to church, and then the danger is that because we do this, we think that we're okay. After all, we know God's revealed will, the Bible, so well. We can find a verse for everything. Ultimately, it can become very easy to imagine, as we look around the world around us, that we have the truth of God, so we're okay. And then there's arrogance. You see, this delusion can lead to the deadly pride of arrogant presumption. And we see this in verses 19 to 20. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, and instructors to the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Very often, those who have that sort of pride, they're insufferable. And that's what it did to the Jews. They fancied themselves as guides, lights, correctors, teachers. And so they looked down with condescension on others. And the Gentiles, of course, they sensed this and they resented it. A historian, Tacitus, said, "Among themselves their honesty is inflexible, their compassion quick to move. But to all other persons they show the hatred of antagonism." That's what people thought about the Jews. So the very privileges that should have produced saints, instead it produced arrogant, loveless egotists instead. Having religious privilege can breed self-righteousness, self-centeredness, self-deception. Jesus talks of this in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 13. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: "God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get." But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." God, I thank you that I am not like other men. When I first heard this sermon as a relatively new Christian, my thought was, I'm glad I'm not like that Pharisee. And then it suddenly hit me. You see, if as followers of Christ we ever feel superior, we should beware that an attitude of superiority is not a sign of God's grace. And then we have the reality in verses 21 to 24. So Paul now turns the tables on them. They don't live up to their knowledge. They don't practice what they preach. So now Paul asks 5 rhetorical questions that show their inconsistency. Verse 21, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So first of all, there's a general rhetorical question. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? And then that's followed by 3 questions about particular sins. While you preach against stealing, do you not steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who abhor idols is an accurate portrayal of Jews. They would recoil in horror from idolatry. They wouldn't dream of going anywhere near an idol temple, except maybe for the purpose of robbery. The Jewish leaders think that they're not guilty of any of these. But when theft, adultery and sacrilege are strictly and biblically understood, especially as we read about in the Sermon on the Mount, there is no one who isn't guilty of all 3. I said it reminds us, doesn't it, of the Sermon on the Mount and about the thoughts of our hearts. Paul's 5th rhetorical question is again more general, verse 23. You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. I have been in despair on a few occasions when someone who claims to be a Christian has behaved in such a way that one of my sons, who is not a Christian, was able to say, I'm far better than they are. I wouldn't do something like that. We need to be careful, don't we, that we don't blaspheme the name of God amongst the Gentiles, the non-believers, because of our behaviour. Now this quotation actually seems to combine Isaiah 52 verse 5 and Ezekiel chapter 36 verse 22. In both these verses, God's name had been mocked because his people had been defeated and enslaved. Could Yahweh not protect his own people? And moral defeat, like military defeat, brings discredit on the name of God. And those people had been defeated and enslaved because of their behaviour, because they had turned away from God and worshipped other idols. Abraham experienced essentially the same thing when he told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. And so Pharaoh took her into his harem. And after the discovery, Abraham and Sarah went away. And Abraham had no more testimony for God before the Egyptians. His credibility was shot. Stuart Briscoe tells about having to deal with a fellow employee who'd embezzled a large sum of money from the bank for which they both worked. The reason the man embezzled was that he had 2 wives and families to support. When he was apprehended and fired, he stunned everyone by saying, "I am very sorry for what I've done, and I need to know whether I should fulfill my preaching commitments on Sunday in our local church." Tragic, isn't it? But Briscoe says that in the following weeks he spent a great part of his time mending the damage that the man had done by this blatant inconsistency. He discovered that his fellow workers not only despised this particular man, but were so quick as a result to dismiss the church he belonged to as a bunch of hypocrites. The gospel he professed to believe, they thought that was a load of hogwash, and the God he claimed to serve as being non-existent. And that, of course, is why we cringe when we read of a prominent Christian figure running off with his curate, male or female, or we hear of the appointment of a homosexual bishop. That is blaspheming God's name among non-Christians. But let's not forget that God's name is blasphemed, even by what we might consider littler sins, less prominent sins. The only difference, of course, is that the audience is much wider. The arguments of verses 17 to 24 are just as applicable today to us as it was to the hypocritical moralizers and self-confident Jews. If we judge others, we must be able to judge ourselves. If we teach others, we should be able to teach. We must be able to teach ourselves. If we set ourselves up as either teachers or judges of others, we can have no excuse if we do not teach or judge ourselves. The second danger relates to circumcision in verses 25 to 29. If the Jews' possession and knowledge of the law didn't exempt them from the judgment of God, neither did their circumcision. Circumcision was a God-given sign, and it was a seal of his covenant promise with them. But it wasn't a magical ceremony or a charm. It didn't give them fully comprehensive insurance cover against the wrath of God. It wasn't to be a substitute for obedience. It required a commitment to obedience. And yet, sadly, the Jews had an almost superstitious confidence in the saving power of their circumcision. Rabbinic epigrams expressed it like this. For example, circumcised men do not descend into Gehenna, and circumcision will deliver Israel from Gehenna. So how does Paul counter their false assurance? Well, verse 25a says, "For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law." He says that it only has value on the grounds that the one who is circumcised is required to obey the whole law. So Galatians chapter 5 verse 3 says, "I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law." Circumcision is a sign of covenant membership, and covenant membership demands obedience. Circumcision and the law belong together in God's covenant. And so now we have Paul making two bold statements. On the one hand, in verse 25, the latter part of verse 25, if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. On the other hand, verse 26, so if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? We can express it with two simple equations. Circumcision minus obedience is equivalent to uncircumcision. Uncircumcision plus obedience is equivalent to circumcision. Now that would have been a huge shock to Jewish people. They picture themselves sitting in judgment on the uncircumcised pagans, but the roles will be reversed. And verse 27, then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. He who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code, the law, and circumcision, but break that law. The ultimate sign, the genuine evidence of membership of the covenant of God, is not circumcision, and it is not possession of the law, but the obedience that both circumcision and the law demand. Their circumcision didn't make them what their disobedience proved they were not. Now, this is not salvation by obedience, but it's showing us that obedience is the evidence of salvation. And the Jews are just as much subject to the judgment of God as Gentiles. This extraordinary reversal of roles that Paul has described in verse 27, by which the Gentile condemns the Jew instead of the Jew condemning the Gentile, is actually due to a redefinition of Jewish identity that Paul gives. So first he states negatively what a Jew is not in verse 28. He says, for no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly. And then he defines positively what a true Jew is. But a Jew is one inwardly. And then he goes on to explain what he means by that in verse 29b. Circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And this concept occurs quite often in the Old Testament. In the first 5 books of the Bible, God complains of his people's uncircumcised hearts. We read about that in Deuteronomy. He appeals to them to circumcise their hearts, and he promises that he will do it to them himself, so that they may love him with all their being. And the prophets use the same imagery. Foreigners are often described as uncircumcised in heart and flesh. Those who are circumcised only in the flesh and uncircumcised in heart will be punished. Yahweh, God, calls on his people to circumcise their hearts, and he promises to give them a new heart. So what is required is a circumcision of the heart that completely replaces the physical rite and doesn't just complement it. In other words, it's going to be an inward work of the Holy Spirit. So the contrast between the law and the Spirit sums up the difference between the old covenant, which is an external law, and the new covenant, which is the gift of the Spirit. So the true Jew is no longer defined by blood descent from Abraham, by male circumcision, and keeping the law given through Moses. With the coming of Christ and his death and resurrection, It fulfilled the promises of God through the prophets. God has abolished his covenant with his particular people, the nation Israel. And it's been replaced by a new covenant that's based on the forgiveness of sins through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the inner working of the Spirit of God, changing the heart towards keeping the law. But this covenant, this new circumcision, it only applies to those who acknowledge Jesus as their Messiah and Lord, regardless of whether they are Jews or Gentiles. The temporary era of the law has passed, and it's now been superseded by the permanent era of Christ and the Holy Spirit. But nevertheless, at the same time, God will still honour his promises to Abraham by saving many from his historic people of Israel. But not all in the bloodline of Abraham are true Jews. True salvation is a matter of the heart. A little bit later in Romans, in chapter 10, verses 9 and 10, it says this: "If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." So the question is, do you rely on outward signs? Do you rely on the fact you come to church, you go to Bible studies, you give money to the church? Your parents were Christians, you've been christened, you've been confirmed, or you've been baptized. Are you relying on those?